This is where theology meets the real world. This is So What About Us? A podcast about tackling real-life problems through the lens of Scripture, learning how to apply God's Word to every single area of life. Because the Christian faith isn't just something we study, it's something we live. In this episode, Pastor Stephen is joined by Sarah Lingerfelt, a member of the women's leadership team, to discuss Mark 5:21-43 from Pastor Stephen's sermon entitled A Tale of Two Daughters. And now, let's ask the question, so what about us?
All right, here we go. So what about us? This is episode 13. I keep forgetting every week. One of these days I'm going to get
Lucky number 13.
Lucky number 13. All right, well, I'm Pastor Stephen, and today I'm not joined by the two teaching elders, but I'm joined by...
someone of a different variety. I am female, yes. I'm Sarah Lingerfelt.
Sarah Lingerfelt. Now, Sarah,
Yeah.
Are you vice president of the women's leadership team?
I am not vice president of the women's leadership team.
You were president for a time, right?
I was not.
Never
But
mind.
thank you for thinking so highly of me.
Well, that's what I think of you. That's how
Okay, so actually, I've held like a couple positions through women's leadership. I spent a little bit of time in outreach, and right now I'm in the area of Christian growth. So I kind of handle events. But, you know, that job description is always taking shape. And, you know, I love being involved in women's ministry. I've done it for several years now.
Very good. All right. Well, I think everybody will see why we have Sarah here. So as we go through the story today it starts with Jairus and his daughter. Then there's this episode with a woman. And I thought it was just important, as I think through this, to hear a woman's perspective on these things and to glean as much insight from Sarah as I can. So she is going to do a great job helping me think through this. All right, I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to just start talking about what I see here. So Jesus has left the demoniac. It was his only purpose. And he gets back in the boat, and he goes back across the sea. It says, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better but grew worse. And she heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. All right, so there's a part of this that I can feel on like a deeply personal level. I have a daughter who at her next birthday will be 12 years old. And so I get Jairus. I get how a guy who is the ruler of the synagogue, well-respected, well thought of, probably a man of means, is at his wit's end, and he will run all the way to the boat and throw himself at Jesus' feet, which is an interesting contrast because you have the demoniac who is the most out there, helpless, lowly thought of person, and Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, and they are both just at Jesus' feet. And make this point, at least in my manuscript so far, that sorrow and desperation will drive everybody to the feet of Jesus. It is a great equalizer in our lives.
That's definitely where I came to in this, like that point, you know, I drew these contrasts, not necessarily between Jairus and the demoniac, but Jairus and the woman too. You know, you've got so many polarities in this story. You know, he's very prominent, he's clean. You know, there's a very public boldness to him. And anyway, Jairus comes boldly, and he's a religious leader. And I think I just put myself in that he's at a point of desperation, right? Would he have fallen at Jesus's feet if he was not at this point? He's dealing with something that's very precious to him. That's his daughter. You're talking about this. Was he one of the criticizing religious leaders before this? You know, kind of watching from afar, you know, judging, conspiring, ridiculing. I think this was a huge risk he's taking here because his cohorts are likely judging him too. He could be risking losing some friendships here. But how quickly our priorities rise to the surface when met with something of this caliber.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and then I also took it a step further. Like, the Pharisees were really thinking that Jesus was demonic, you know, like what he was teaching, and like, this is not of God.
I mean, they've explicitly said that, like, right? This man has a demon.
So really, I'm thinking, like, this could be, yes, a burgeoning faith driven by intense need, but was there also this desperation of, like, is there a world where Jairus was trying anything and everything to save his little girl? I don't know. Like, I just put a lot of suppositions, but I think we can all see ourselves in Jairus.
I do think there's faith here. Yeah. Now, I'm going to come back to how strong I think it is, but he says, if you come and you touch her, she will be made well. And so there's something in Jairus that, maybe he was on the edge of the crowd. Maybe he was curious before, but his little girl's sick at home. And I get this, man. Like, if there was a hint of thought in me that I could save her life, right, I'd be, what do you want? What do you want? Jesus, you want my arm? You want my leg? You want my eyes?
I tap this really because, like, during the COVID crisis, my oldest daughter actually spent a semester living in Texas with my sister. And care being as it was, like, or lack thereof, really, she actually became very ill and got to the point of sepsis. So she had to go into the hospital. And the check-ins were so rare that she actually got to the point of like 40% oxygen and was dying.
Oh.
And I get the call that next morning. This is like very early in the COVID crisis, and Atlanta's a no-fly city.
Oh.
So here I am in this desperation of, like, I was willing to do anything and everything to get to her.
I'll
Is this
walk
going to be
Texas,
the last?
right?
I've got to get to my little girl. So, and I just went. I couldn't even get in the hospital. They wouldn't let me in. I just touched the outside of the hospital. So this level of desperation. I mean, I was demanding. You know, just you get raw.
So this is a good point. So the way this reads, it's just, sometimes we read these stories and they just come across just, I don't know. They don't have that emotion that is there. So when it says here that it says he implored him earnestly. The way that I think you ought to translate that, it's an imperfect verb, which means it's likely something going on. And then there's this emphasizer article with it. I think it should be translated something like, he was begging him over and over and over and over. Like, please come, please come, please come, please come. And so Jesus goes with him. I'm going to come back to that, but that's no incidental detail. He goes with him. All right, so on the way, he encounters this woman. And I was talking to Rick a few weeks ago, and he's preaching ahead of Mark at this new church. And he made the point to me that if Jesus was an ER doctor, he'd be sued for malpractice. Because on the way to a dying girl, he stops instead of sprinting there. But he encounters this woman, and she's had this discharge of blood for 12 years. And there's a lot wrapped up in that kind of thing. So I want to sort of describe it, and then I want to hear your reflections sort of on this situation, Sarah. This whole chapter is just full of uncleanness. So you have the demoniac, full of unclean spirits. The pigs are unclean animals. They're in an unclean Gentile territory. This woman's problem is certainly physiological, but it's also theological. She is trapped in uncleanness. So if you go read Leviticus, where all the holiness codes are, the high point of everything in the ceremonial law in the Old Testament is Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, when all the sins and uncleanliness are dealt with. And the chapter right before that, so if you think about that, kind of climbing a mountain, if that's the peak, the chapter right before it in 15 is the laws of bodily discharges, which is uncomfortable to read, and I won't read it all through here. And, something is so important about this kind of situation that the Lord, uses it as the thing to not come into the temple when you're like this. And I think we often think of, here's how I want to sort of perspective shape this. Uncleanliness is a ceremonial theological category because it's wrapped up in what the temple in the Old Testament law was supposed to do, which was create a promise. So God is in his temple. He is dwelling with his people. And this is a little picture, right, that God is making a promise through this visualization that one day he will dwell with his people actually. And this temple is just a shadow of what's coming. And not allowing what I would call unwholeness into the presence of God is his way of also saying, and the only people in my presence will be whole people. So I can give you a whole paper that I wrote one time in seminary about the animals in the Old Testament and why sharks are unclean, but trout are clean, this sort of thing. I think I stole this phrase from John Piper. Leaky bodies that leak life fluid, whether men or women, are unclean because they're unwhole. They represent bodies that are not, I'm using air quotes, perfect and whole. So this is why unclean animals or, animals with defects don't suffice as sacrifices, because only wholeness can come into the presence of God. So it's less a statement about like a social construct, and it's more a statement about the promise of God to dwell with his people and what that will ultimately look like. Having said that, that then manifests itself in this horrible situation where it's also a social construct that this woman had to live in. And if you read Leviticus 15, she's almost described explicitly in that chapter of somebody who is dealing with this issue outside of the normal female course and timeline, that it just goes on. And she is just habitually unclean, and anything she touches is unclean. So ultimately, we're going to get to, she comes to Jesus in fear and trembling. And I think it's because she knows that she's just made him unclean in her mind. That's what she's thinking. I've transferred my uncleanness onto him. And no matter how much faith I had, I've just done this horrible thing to this great rabbi that I had all this faith in. But she does come to him, and we'll come back to that. But I'll make one last comment. So Jesus, when he heals her, and even when Mark describes it, calls this her disease. And this is actually a really great illustration of why it's so important for pastors to learn the biblical languages. A lot of people go to seminary and they take whatever the minimal viable Greek and Hebrew credits are. And that's a shame, because it's like the most important thing you do in seminary. And so I took lots of it because my wife worked and I had lots of time to sit in the library and study. And so not everybody has that great gift. But, learning Greek and Hebrew doesn't allow you to see some magnificent truth in the Bible that otherwise is hidden. That's not true. Everything that I can see in Greek, you can see in English. But what it does, it lets me see shades of colors. Where we all see green, I might can see hunter green, or I might can see, trying to think what that ugly North Hall green was, Kelly green. This word that Mark uses here and that Jesus uses here for disease is not the word he usually uses for disease. It's mastigo. Mastigo is only used a couple of other times in the New Testament, and it's almost always exclusively used to describe something like flogging. So when Paul in Acts chapter 22, they say, let's drag this guy before the tribunal and let's flog him so that we can find out what's going on with it. It's this word, or it's a variant of this word. The way you probably should translate this is this woman's torment. Like, she is in a tormented type situation, and you should equate it to like being licked with a cat with 9 tails or something like that. All right. I have talked a ton.
I will.
All right.
I will speak to this. Okay.
I've reached the limit of what I can say.
You definitely have limits on me. I'm sorry. But so I'm going to echo some of what you said. You're speaking about the Levitical law, and going to go directly to like a particular passage in Haggai, which I just taught on, actually. They're asking him, Haggai questions like, if this touches this, does it transfer to this and such? And it's going this back and forth.
What's the passage? I want to just look it up.
It's from Haggai 2.
Okay.
Towards the end, they're asking these questions, and so you're dead on in the sense that there is, if she knows anything about the scriptures, like she knows that touching him could transfer her uncleanness, right? Even touching his robe, it's such a risk, right? Also, I love that you're pulling out that it is important to look at these original words, because it's not secret knowledge. It's just there are language barriers in the translation. And so like knowing where this word was used again and how to connect certain scriptures with other scriptures is super important, which did bring me to Malachi 4:2. So another word, if you're comparing Mark with like Matthew and Luke on this passage, Some of them say fringe, some of them, there's the tassels. And from what we know back on the priestly garments, that part was often called the wings. And the word that is used for that part of the garment that she's touching is that kanaf, which is wings. Okay, so the wings of his prayer shawl is what she would have been touching. And so if she knew the scriptures, so it looks like she kind of knows Haggai, she definitely knows Levitical law. What if, she's familiar with this passage from Malachi 4:2 where there's healing in his wings? Like, is there just this big what if, like, if I could, is it true? Is there a chance? I also love the beauty of, it talks about this thronging crowd, right? That's all around Jesus. This was her one chance, Stephen. To not be noticed. There was no other chance.
That's great. I hadn't thought about that.
Even the thronging crowd, God has sovereignty over. Like, it's annoying. The last time that he was in it, he had to get in a boat.
Yeah.
So they're pressing in all around him. Like, this is her one shot. Stephen.
And Jesus is orchestrating these setting, like with the boat, right? And so this is, to your point, he lets the crowd get big so this woman will try to touch it.
Yeah, this is literally her one chance. And I will speak, like, the discharge, like, speaking from someone who's dealt with this in spades, and like I actually had to have surgery, and like it's a lot. Like, there's a lot more that comes with it. I mean, you have like anemia, fatigue, hair loss, weakness. There's a lot of pain, cramping, stomach issues. Like, this is all encompassing, let alone the social issues.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know. Like, was this woman married? Did she have children before this womb that potentially brought her great joy is now her curse? Is she separated from her husband and children because of this, uncleanness? Has this just become something that is just such a place of agony for her? But this is definitely her one chance to touch Jesus, to even get in there, because she could be just cast aside if it had been less people. And I also want to say, like, she could have come right on out like Jairus and ask a favor. And I just think there's a lot here. I love this part. There's just maybe tries their healing in his wings. And I know we haven't gotten to Jesus's response yet, but I just wanted to point out that there's a lot here. Also, the point about the physicians. I'm grateful for the intervention of medicine. I just put a lot of supposition into text. I think, were these people that were taking advantage of her and taking all her money, or was this like people really trying to help and she's just having her hopes dashed time and time again? I just remember like going to doctors. They don't take you seriously. You're spending all your money. Oh, there's nothing wrong with you. This is normal. Just take this. That's what everybody does. And there's no solution and it never stops. Like, there are times where not just the uncleanness, but even for people today, where it's preventing them from participating in normal activities. It's really life altering, this kind of condition.
That's this is exactly why I invited Sarah, right? Because I read this text and I was like, well, there's a very cut and dry theological ceremonial element to this. I didn't even think about the fact that, like, there's a host of other physical maladies that would come with this sort of thing. And that's a great point that, like, in this text, I'll probably say this on Sunday, there's only one verb. So for 2 entire verses, and we put periods and we change things to smooth it out in English, there's only one verb, which is she touched. And everything leading up to touched his garment is a participle, so an ing word. So the way that I'm going to read this on Sunday is, there was a woman there who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians, who had spent all that she had, who had grew worse but not better, who had heard the reports about Jesus, who had came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. There's this like building sense of just exhausting desperation that comes, where Mark is just stacking up participles to make you just feel like this woman is at her literal wit's end.
We got 2 desperate people here.
Yes, that's exactly right. And she does what? She falls at his feet. So you have these 3 characters in a row that fall at the feet of Jesus. Now, there is this odd thing where she touches him and he heals her, and then he acts like he doesn't know who touched him. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't have like an explanation for that. And you can get real clever about.
Well, I do.
Oh,
supposition. Okay, we're always supposing.
This is speculation, right?
This is speculation because it's not obvious. But this is where it does take some humanity to put yourself in their shoes. She's an outcast. This is on purpose that Jesus is making this public.
Right.
So she is horrified that he is calling attention to her.
So you think he knows? He's just I think he probably knows, and he's just creating a situation that allows her to voluntarily come forward.
Yeah.
Because he could just say, you I know it was you.
Yeah.
But instead, I think there's a bit of coyness where he just says like, I wonder who did this. And this woman gets the opportunity to then voluntarily fall before him.
But he says this, and like Jairus is there. Everybody's following Jairus and Jesus here.
Yeah.
They're all looking at Jairus and Jesus. They're like, so, this is a big time guy. Jesus going to do this big healing. And then I just imagine the crowd just turning an instant and looking at this woman. I imagine like if she's down reaching the bottom of his shawl, she's got to be on the ground.
Could be, but Jesus acts like he doesn't know that it's her. If it was that obvious that the crowd knew, then Jesus would have known immediately, right?
No, not that the crowd knew. But what I'm saying is he calls attention to her.
Oh, yeah,
and,
yeah.
Like all eyes turn on her. And I imagine she is horrified. She has tried to sneak in. She is being as covert as possible.
Oh, yeah. But I don't know. So my point is, I don't know why Jesus says, I don't know who touched me.
Oh, that part.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there are a lot of, again, clever explanation. I think it's best to just say like, I think Jesus is creating space for her to do exactly what you said.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so she
for her
comes.
to come forward.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is these words get repeated over and over in this chapter. We'll talk about Mark's sandwich method, but Jairus says, if you come and touch my daughter, she will be made well. And this woman says, if I touch him, I will be made well. And Jesus is eventually going to say, you've been made well. Go in peace. So I don't know what to do with the fact that Jesus plays like he doesn't know who it is. But this woman gets the opportunity. See, I think you're right on it. She could have just drifted away. Like she's been healed. She knows she's been healed. Why doesn't she just slink away into the crowd, right? Like there's no reason this woman comes to Jesus voluntarily unless she believes that Jesus probably already knows who she is. Like she believes he's so powerful that he's going to identify her anyway. And that so she comes to him in this fear and trembling. And it says she tells him the whole truth. Like, this is what I did. This is what I thought. Here's what I did. I touched you. I'm unclean. You're the rabbi. Like, this sort of thing.
I see this very similar to the woman at the well because I think
that's a great affirmation.
Listen, the reality is the closer we come to the light, the more that's exposed, right?
Right.
And so in this really raw encounter with Jesus, it says she's already healed in that moment. He knows the healing's come out of him. It says she was immediately dried up. And then it says she tells him the whole truth. Mm-hmm. And this is where it locks me into that woman of the well. It's like Jesus leans into that woman and then all of a sudden she just vomits it all up. I want to suppose the whole truth, there's more to that.
Well, I think that's a great observation though. Like, because he asks her at the well, where is your husband? And he knows good and well.
Yes.
So she's got 5, right? He tells her immediately. And I just wonder if this is the same thing.
Stephen, he asked the blind man, tell me what it is that you need.
That's a great point, right?
Come on. He does this all the time. He wants them to consider.
Right. It does read a little bit more forceful. Like, I'll admit, it says, and he looked around to see who had done it. That's a little bit, and I can't get that to translate like he looked around to see who would volunteer. Like, there is a bit more like forceful ignorance that Jesus sort of displays here. And I don't mean that in a negative way, like that he genuinely doesn't know. But I think you're probably right, which is that he over and over again sort of creates space for people to just come to him and admit things, safely in some ways.
But doesn't he know our own weaknesses? Doesn't he understand our social anxieties, our things where he knows where we need the space to come? It's like you consider your audience. He's considering his audience every time he considers his audience. Yeah. He meets people exactly where they're at. And I think that's what he's doing with her here. And in this exposure to Jesus, it's like when you're touched in such a real way. I mean, I cannot imagine the immense relief and then fear, like what has just happened to me. Mm-hmm. And then she tells him the whole truth. Like, I'm going to suppose that there is a lot more to this story. I just think there's a second moment here where he says that she's healed again. Healed of what? And I just got to suppose, like, is there shame? Is there something in her past? Is there a second disease process? Is there something there where there was more to it? And I think we know through all the healings, like, there's this parallel of physical healing and a spiritual healing. I think that's there, but this reads more to me. Yeah. And he calls her daughter.
Okay, that's the best part of the whole thing.
That's the best part of this whole thing. Stephen, she's parallel in preciousness to Jairus' daughter now.
Yes.
Now we're equal.
Right.
We got 2 daughters that are greatly in need.
So I think I wonder too on the healing part. I had sort of a similar thought, but I wonder if this was Jesus' way of saying, you wonder if she had been falsely healed by a physician for, say, a month or something like that, or a couple days. And Jesus is telling her this is a sort of a permanent healing to you in some ways. So he calls her daughter. And as he's saying, daughter, your faith has made you well, the exact thing that Jairus has asked for, make my daughter well, the people show up and they say, your daughter is dead. You might as well leave Jesus here, right? There's no point in bringing Jesus. And as this is happening, it's like Jesus sort of catches that fear and that doubt rising up in Jairus' throat and heart and says, don't do that. Don't fear, only believe. And this is the word believe. It's pisteuo. It's the exact same word for faith. So your faith has made you well. And he immediately says, your daughter's dead. And he says, don't fear, have faith.
This is worst case scenario for Jairus.
This is
Listen,
the worst.
Let's just enter Jairus' head for a minute. I mean, come on, Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
My daughter is dying. We're going to stop? We should be rushing.
Right.
Why aren't we? It's like watching paramedics walk slowly. Like there's something altogether wrong here with the stress and anxiety. Like the sun is descending. Like time is of the essence. We're going to stop and heal this unclean outcast. I'm a religious leader. I'm important.
Right.
Don't you understand how much influence could be? I just entered Jairus' head, his angst, his anxiety here. And I gotta put myself with Jairus. Stephen, like there's been so many times, like just in my own sin nature, like I have begged God for things like with my children, crying out to him for things. And I've watched like other people's kids receive the blessings. I've watched like the rocky places made smooth for others. And there's just this feeling about, what about me? What about my kids?
What about us?
Jesus? What about us? I've seen, you see one person healed, another not.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know this about my story. I've seen some people gain freedom and addiction, and like I buried my spouse in it. It's like, what about me? Have you forgotten about me? And I serve you faithfully. I'm faithful, Jesus. I'm committed. What about me? And you got to think Jairus, he's committed. He's a religious leader. He's walking the walk.
Yeah.
What about me? What about my situation?
So I want to skip to the end because I want to spend time talking about what's the point of this story, right? So Jesus goes with Jairus and he heals this girl. He says, Talitha Kumi, which I think is just, there's speculation, and I want this to be true, right? That Peter is telling this story to Mark, and that it's so vivid in his memory that Peter feels compelled that Mark record it in the original Aramaic. These are the words that came out of his mouth, and then that little girl's heart started beating again, and the blood came back into her face, and she woke up. That like Peter was so struck by this, because he's not done anything like this. He's calmed a storm, and these are great miracles, but this is calling somebody back from the dead, which is in and of itself is interesting, that he speaks to her and she hears him, right? She's dead. She's not sleeping. There's some speculation, right? Well, was she really just asleep and Jesus is just really good at identifying who's asleep versus who's dead? She's definitely dead. They're not so dumb as they can't identify a dead body. And so Jesus calls her back from the dead. She gets up and she walks around, right? So this isn't some gradual thing. This isn't like she swooned and she was just unconscious and she woke back up and gradually got better. She gets up, she walks, and then she starts eating, which is, I think, interesting because in Luke, which by the way, in Luke, when he describes the woman, he leaves out that she had wasted all of her money on doctors, which is funny because Luke was a doctor. So maybe he's like, is leaving that out? In Luke, Jesus asks for, give me some fish, give me something to eat. When he's resurrected from the dead is sort of this evidence that he's a real human, right? She's not a ghost. She's walking, she's eating, she's talking. But I want to just sort of pick at this with you as well, Sarah. So Mark has these sandwich methods. He tells a story, and in the middle of the story, there's something else that happens that informs the other halves of the story. So if it's a hamburger, the meat in the middle helps you understand something better about the two buns. So you have Jairus comes, Jairus at the end, in the middle is this woman. And there's a lot of parallels we've already talked about, being made well, faith, this falling at Jesus's feet. I have thoughts, but I would love to hear yours first. Like, what is Mark trying to do and Jesus trying to do ultimately by putting these two things together?
I don't know if I'm going to nail this or not. I think the point here is Jesus, by the way, and Jesus knowing us so intimately that he knows exactly what our hearts need and what the people around him need at the time. I do think it's interesting at this point when he goes off with Jairus towards the house now, after the woman's healed, he only takes a few with him. Yeah. And I think it's really special in this last part of the story, before I get to the meat there, that he's not giving up on Jairus in these now what moments. He's following through on this, and he gets intimate with Jairus in that room. And it's just him and his wife and this little girl and then the three disciples. I wonder, is he saying, she's just sleeping to the crowd just to kind of put off like this resurrection hype? Like, is he only saying that to the crowd? Not that he believes that she's really sleeping, but just kind of putting them off, like just so that because he doesn't want this news to spread about this resurrection.
Which is, to double click on that for 1 second, right? So this is one of the many times Jesus is going to say, don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
So why doesn't he want anybody to know about this, to this point, the greatest thing that's ever happened? And I think what I've seen consistently in Mark, every time Jesus does this, it's to prevent people from wanting too little. So we talked about this in the beginning, right? That, Jesus knows that our hearts are so sinful and we love this world in its sin so much that, this girl dies. She's raised to life and she dies. And people would be content if just every time you died, Jesus brought you back and you got 50 more years. And then you died again. And then he raised you again, you got 50 more years, and then you died again. I bet 99.99% of people would be like, I'd be okay with that deal. I love this world. I love my sin. I love, these things. And, what more could I possibly want than to be raised from the dead and get another 50 years? Or, the people in the beginning wanted to be healed. And it's like, yeah, you just want to live a little bit longer here. That's all. That's the greatest thing you can imagine, is to just live 20 more years here. And, if I had a magic spell on this table that said, like, I can make you live to be 300 years old, there would be people from here to Atlanta. They would,
Absolutely.
The crowd would be.
We always want what Jesus offers more than Jesus himself.
Well, then I stand up there on Sunday and I say, you can live forever. And it's like, well, that doesn't sound, all I have to do is believe. I don't want anything to do. It's just, it's maddening how our hearts work. And I think here he's saying very clearly, like, I don't want anybody to think that this is the best thing there is. The resurrection is not this resurrection. You are not supposed to look at this girl and have hope that Jesus will do this for you. That is not the hope. The hope is that when he says, I will raise you forever on the last day, that this is sort of a down payment on that. I can do that thing that I said I will do. The dead will hear me. This girl is evidence of it. There's also something about faith here that we'll talk about, but this you should not hope for too little. Yeah, you shouldn't hope for too little like this. Go ahead.
There's so much here. There really are, and there's so many juxtapositions, but I think this is an intimate moment with Jairus too, and Jairus being a religious leader, like Jairus has asked him to touch his unclean daughter. I mean, this is huge. Jesus reaches and touches this dead body. This is so huge. This clean ruler. This is radical, risky. Jesus is a reaching Jesus.
It's the reverse of the woman. She touches him. He touches this little girl.
I love the contrast in this story. This is just such a cool one, how it connects. And, just this desperation, this heart of doubt, he's a quote unquote clean ruler, and Jesus reaching into the uncleanness in Jairus's home. Just such a parallel to like touching the uncleanness in our hearts. I just think this is such a special, intimate moment. I also love he calls the woman daughter, he calls this girl daughter, and if you look at the other Gospels, 2 daughters here. The day that this girl was being created in the womb was the day that this problem started for this woman. I just think that's such a beautiful...
Yeah, they're both 12 years.
Poetry there. Jesus planned these stories intersecting. He's sovereignly weaving these stories together. This woman's 12 years of shame and suffering, this girl's illness that drove her parents to be desperate, to have this grief. I think this is such a cool story of 2 daughters and 2 desperate people. But I think ultimately what the point is, and this point is really driven in the Gospel of Luke, but I think it's being driven in these 2 stories, is the upside down kingdom. Who you think I came for and why you think I come is so vastly opposite. I'm going to do a resurrection with 3 people in the room, and I'm going to highlight this outcast woman in front of everyone. But it was the passage where you were talking about the hills made low and the valleys risen up, and this equal plane. And I think that's kind of what's going on here, is there's this great equalizer here in these 2 stories of Jesus saying, I'm going to raise up to daughter this unclean, and I'm going to show Jairus who I really am. Yeah. And that we're all kind of on this equal plane needing him.
That's a great point. One of my favorite things that I've taken away myself from this series on Mark is the muddy riverbanks of the Jordan, where everybody's there, vile, weak, poor, self-righteous, these sort of folks. Richard actually told me a few weeks ago, I didn't know this, but one of the reasons that church choirs used to wear robes was it's a visible symbol of equality. It doesn't matter what you came in here wearing, suit, trash, whatever, we're all dressed in the righteousness of Christ together and equal. And I think that's wonderful. I wish I could find a reason to kick the robes back out for that reason and explain it. But anyway, I think that's a great point, which is there is a great equalizer of sin here that brings all these people desperately to Jesus. I think Jesus is trying to tell us something about faith here too. So I think Jairus has some faith, but I think he's pretty weak. He's a pretty weak faith. And so in the middle, Jesus is ultimately not, he stops and he lets Jairus' daughter die. And I love what you said about Jesus has been weaving this story for 12 years. He has been planning this event for 12 years. That woman will be here, that crowd will gain, she will touch his robe, and Jairus' 12-year-old daughter will die. And this is no accident. So I think Jesus wants Jairus to learn something about faith from this woman who never doubts. And she's got such strong faith that Jesus can heal her. Look, she's not a theologian, right? She's not like, well, here's what justification means, blah, 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 blah. She's like, look, if I touch him, he'll heal me. And she's got this just blazing hot faith that is radical. And she even comes to Jesus and tells him what she did when she could have easily just drifted off into the crowd. And so I think Jesus is trying to say, Jairus, you see this woman. This is the kind of faith you ought to have that just believes that I can do what I say I can do, no matter what. It doesn't matter what the barrier is. And as the people come and they say, your daughter is dead, Jesus says, no barrier, not even this, Jairus. Don't fear, only believe. Did I not come with you? I think that's the key point. That's almost like, let us go across to the other side, and he went with him. I'm with you. I think that you should read Jairus' request to Jesus as a prayer, and that Jesus going with him is a yes. And now he wants to know, how much do you believe my yes? Even when your daughter's dead? I think Jairus' faith is weak. And the point I'm going to draw out at the end is, it doesn't matter how strong Jairus' faith is. At no point in this story is Jesus like, well, Jairus, if you just believe hard enough, I will heal your daughter. You got to get to a 10. Right now you're at a 4. Let's keep working on it. It doesn't matter what Jairus' faith looks like. This is about Jesus' strength and his power and his love. And by the end, I think that's sort of the point of the story is Jesus says, weak faith, strong faith. Faith will make you well. We're going to sing He Will Hold Me Fast. And I pick that because I think it's very important, especially right now in our moment. People are asking lots of questions. Can Christians do X, Y, and Z? It doesn't matter what Christians do. It matters who Jesus is. I told this story in Sunday school one time years ago, but on the 4th of July, Emma used to be really scared of fireworks. She's my now 12-year-old. So this was back when we lived in Kentucky, and we would have these neighborhood fireworks shows that were probably legitimately dangerous, and we probably shouldn't have been doing them. But she was terrified of fireworks, and so she would run to me, and she would just, cling like my skin to me, right? She's just digging her claws in. She's holding me tight. She is terrified, and she thinks I can save her. And the point that I made in Sunday school and I'll make on Sunday is, if she had suddenly in a moment thought, I just don't know if I'm safe with this guy. I don't know. My faith in him and his ability to keep me safe is going to fail for a moment. And I'm going to let go, and I'm just going to drop my arms, and I just don't think he can do it. I'm going to go weak. It wouldn't have mattered because I'm the one holding her. No matter how much she clings to me, that gives her a deeper sense of us. There is truth and goodness, and there's help there. But at the end of the day, what matters is how strong I am and how much I love her. And so if she goes weak, I'm still holding her, and she's not going to drop for a second. And so I think there's just that encouragement that he will not break a bruised reed. He will not snuff out a smoldering wick. Jesus will love the woman with the strongest faith we can possibly imagine that would crawl through a crowd and touches the hem of his garment. And Jairus, who is probably full of doubts and doesn't really know, but maybe Jesus can help. That Jesus loves both of these people, and he will hold us fast, and he will be the one who keeps us. And that should be this great encouragement to us.
Absolutely. And that is what the story is about, is just how glorious Jesus is, because he brings attention to this outcast, this loving, tender time with her. And then he walks intimately with Jairus. He doesn't leave him there in that, anxiety and what if and doubt.
Doesn't scold him.
He doesn't scold any of them here. He walks with him. He doesn't give up on his quest with Jairus. So whether we're in this place of doubt or in this place of just desperately, could this be a healing to touch his garment? I think in our prayers when we're really asking God for these big things, he's so tender with us. He doesn't sit there and judge us in how we're coming to him. it says he's perfecting all of our groanings. And so whether we're coming from a place of, he knows too when we're just asking for things just to get things, and he's so tender with us to walk with us and show us. And Jesus did resurrections a number of ways. And so it's interesting that this one he chose to make so intimate with Jairus. And so I think these are very special stories that give us insight on Jesus's character and just how much love he has for us. And really, he's kind of coming to do things that we don't expect.
Yeah. Nobody in the room thinks this is about what's about to happen. I mean, who knows what Jairus and his wife thought? They were probably just so full of grief. They were like, okay, we'll go in there with you. Do you want to observe the body? All right. Any final thoughts?
Gosh, I don't know. Thank you for having me on here.
That's been great.
Yeah.
Oh, that's been so much fun. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. We'll continue studying the Bible, walking through the scriptures each week, and asking ourselves, so what about us?
Thank you for joining us on this episode of So What About Us? If this show helped you connect the dots between Sunday and the rest of your week, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'd also love to know how you're applying this in your own life. Send us an email at podcast@cmpca.org and let us know. Until next week, remember that Scripture isn't just asking, what about them? It's asking, what about us?